This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture on Willard Van Orman Quine's Epistemology Naturalized. Or as I like to think of it, what to do at Harvard when logical empiricism is dead. In my opinion, this is possibly the single most misunderstood and mischaracterized paper in epistemology. I think there are really two reasons why. One is that the paper turns on some relatively technical material that most epistemologists aren't particularly familiar with. And two, Quine takes pride in pithy aphorisms, which I think does not do the theory justice, and in fact leads people to misunderstand what he's trying to do. Now, when we go to other authors, you can judge for yourself whether or not I'm right or wrong or simply crazy, but I want to make sure that I give it the best face I possibly can. Our lecture outline overall will look as follows. I'll begin with a brief biographical sketch of Quine. Then we'll turn to what he turns to at the beginning of the paper, the project of axiomatization in mathematics. After that, we'll turn to the next project he considers, logical empiricism. We'll look at his criticisms of these two views, why he thinks they failed, and the lessons he thinks he can extract from their failure. And after that, we'll turn to what people primarily focus on when they read the paper, his naturalistic alternative. And we'll try to spell it out in a way that isn't just a bunch of bumper stickers, but that represents, I think, a coherent, thoughtful view that represents the majority of his writings. Let's turn our attention then to the first part of the lecture. After a brief biographical sketch of Quine, we'll turn our focus to the axiomatization project in mathematics. I'll give you a little bit of the history of that project, and then we'll focus on the elements that Quine emphasizes, conceptual studies and doctrinal studies. We'll finish the discussion by noting when, how, and why axiomatization became defunct in mathematics, or largely defunct. Finally, we're going to be talking about a bunch of mathematics in this section. Finally, we're going to be talking about a bunch of mathematics in this module, and you might be scared that you don't understand it or confused or bored. Understandable completely. I'm not trying to teach you a bunch of mathematics. All I'm trying to do is to help you to see the conceptual milieu in which these projects occurred. Focus on the details that Quine focuses on, the conceptual studies and the doctrinal studies. Try and understand the overall flow of the narrative, and you'll be fine. So this is Willard Van Orman Quine. He was born in 1908. By the time he was 20, in 1928, the beginnings of his intellectual and professional life, these were times in which the formal tools of mathematics and logic seemed to be reaching their fullest realization. As we'll see, science was flourishing. Moreover, these formal tools and the general rigor of science appeared to many to offer insight into all areas of intellectual pursuit. It was an exciting time. As an undergraduate, Quine's thinking was shaped by Peano, by Russell, and by Whitehead. During his studies at Harvard as a graduate student, he was further exposed to Whitehead, who was then the chair of Harvard, and to Russell. He went to Europe and he studied under Morris Schlick, Hans Reichenbach, Rudolf Carnap, and Alfred Tarski, returning in 1936. Given his background then, it shouldn't surprise us at all that his discussion of epistemology and of logical empiricism begins with the discussion of this long-standing project in mathematics, and it'll become clearer and clearer as we move through the lecture of why that is. Let's turn our attention to a very brief history of formal axiomatic mathematics. The year that Quine was born, the historian Walter Ball writes that the practice of using definitions, postulates, and axioms in mathematics likely dates back to Plato himself. Nevertheless, it's Euclid of Alexandria who usually gets the credit for this practice. Indeed, many historians believe that Euclid studied at Plato's academy, though as we'll see, it's not even clear Euclid actually was a real person. Euclid is said to have lived between 323 and 283 BCE and worked in Alexandria during Ptolemy I's reign. His image, like the details of his life and even his authorship of the elements, is actually much murkier than normally supposed. The picture below is merely just an artist rendering. Everybody looks like white Jesus when they don't have an actual picture from the historical record, seems like. No actual images of Euclid have survived. In fact, no actual existent texts have Euclid's name on them anywhere. His name doesn't appear in any of the earliest existing copies of the Elements. Indeed, most early copies have references from the edition of Thenon, or the Lectures of Thenon. Historians base Euclid's authorship on a short passage from Proclus Lysias in 412 to 45 AD, a commentary on the Elements that names Euclid as its author. Early editions of the Euclid look a lot like this. In fact, this is a page from the oldest known edition that we have. It's circa around 100 AD. Some historians suggest that Euclid's Elements represents a compilation of several authors who name it after Euclid. But regardless of the authorship, the really important thing is the Elements serves as the main textbook for geometry until the beginnings of the 20th century. It also becomes one of the most influential works in mathematical or scientific thought, even today, really. In fact, it would be really difficult to overestimate the intellectual importance of Euclid's axioms. It was a tremendous intellectual milestone in its time. And axiomatization has many advantages, so it inspired a number of other projects. Axiomatization allows you to give a systematic, rigorous formulation of a body of knowledge that reflects the underlying structure of the domain and which all the knowledge flows from the most certain principles and precisely defined concepts. And it is this beautiful picture of all of our knowledge unfolding from a small set of the most trusted principles and the clearest definitions. This was what drove the attempts to axiomatize other areas of mathematics, the conceptualization of thinking and of knowledge in these terms as well. Interestingly, little seems to have been accomplished for hundreds of years on this project, despite its innate attractiveness. But then, the English algebraist John Wallis was pushing for increased rigor and systematicity in presenting ideas. He's probably most famous for taking Descartes' ideas and translating them so that the English could understand and appreciate Descartes' mathematical works. It was when Georg Cantor invented set theory and used it to prove that there are two different kinds of infinity. There's the countable infinity and there's the uncountable infinity, that things really began to take off. Cantor invents naive set theory. He uses it to show, look, the natural numbers, that's one kind of infinity. The real numbers, that's an infinite number of infinities. This thought was so crazy to mathematicians that Cantor basically had to found his own journal to publish his papers. Nevertheless, the significance, the importance of naive set theory wasn't lost on people like Gottlieb Frege. Frege adopted naive set theory in his own project, a project called logicism. He was going to try to create an axiomatization of mathematics that reduced all of mathematics into logic. Now, not all mathematicians, in fact, most mathematicians, weren't interested in the logicist project, but they were interested in axiomatizing mathematics. And the two most successful versions of axiomatizations of basic arithmetic on the natural numbers is Richard Dundekine and Giuseppe Peano. The third wave represents the final culmination of work in this area. David Hilbert publishes in 1899 his axiomatization of solid geometry, three-dimensional Euclidean geometry. You may not think that was a big deal. It was a huge deal. It was much more complicated than planar geometry. Another person also published axiomatization shortly thereafter. People discovered some difficulties with naive set theory, and Ernest Zermelo published an axiomatization, and work continued until a widely accepted axiomatization of set theory emerged. Russell and Whitehead began working on Principia Mathematica, a systematic attempt to accomplish the sort of goals of the logicist project. And so we see, beginning around 1874 and leading up to the very early days of Quine's life, this tremendous flourishing in mathematics. 1874, Georg Cantor publishes On the Property of the Collection of All Real Algebraic Numbers. 1879, Frege publishes Konzeptschrift, a formal language for pure thought modeled on that of arithmetic. 1899, David Hilbert publishes The Foundations of Geometry. 1910, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead published Volume 1 of Principia Mathematica. 1912, they published Volume 2. In 1913, they published Volume 3. all of this had created this tremendous sense that mathematics was really evolving, it was really developing, that it might even be possible to come up with an axiomatization of all of mathematics. And this was the high water mark of this movement. As Quine notes, the axiomatization project in mathematics has two different studies. On the one hand, there's conceptual studies, the study of concepts with an eye to introducing precise definitions. On the other hand, there's the doctrinal studies, the attempt to prove laws from axioms and postulates. Though Quine equates the axiomatization project with logicism, and it's a much broader project within mathematics, he's right about these two projects. The ideal course of events would be that the clearest concepts are used to define all others, and the most obvious laws are used to prove all others. And the model here is again Euclidean geometry. One starts with definitions of a point, a line, etc., and using only a few highly obvious axioms, one creates a theory of space and the shapes of objects therein. But I don't want to digress into a lecture on the axiomatization of mathematics any farther than I already have. So in the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to the next project, logical empiricism.